Hello Internet, my name is Kiri Callaghan and you're watching Kiriosity, the show where we get down and nerdy on our favorite movies, TV shows, video games, and more. Assassin's Creed Chronicles Russia released this week, which means players will be donning the identity of Nikolai Orlov, who first appeared in the Assassin's Creed comic The Fall. This chapter of Assassin's Creed takes place after the fall of Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor. A fall brought about by a series of revolutions that would change Russia's entire social structure and pave the way for the Soviet Union. So, to help you get into the right spirit for playing the game and to set the scene, I wanted to talk about how some of these events came about historically, especially if your only real experience of the time was watching Don Bluth's 1997 classic Anastasia, which is a lovely movie, but obviously not very historically accurate. Now, first and foremost, what you need to know about Nicholas II is that in his 23-year reign, from when he was coronated in 1894 to his forced abdication in 1917, Imperial Russia went from being one of the great powers of the world to a complete economic and military collapse. Certainly never mentioned in the Don Bluth film, Nicholas II was known as Nicholas the Bloody by his political opponents, and to be fair, not without reason. After his coronation, Nicholas II held festivities for the people at Kadinka Field. Rumors about coronation gifts and food began to spread, and people gathered a day prior in anticipation. The gift that everyone was supposed to receive was a bread roll, sausage, gingerbread, pretzels, and, believe it or not, a commemorative cup. By 5 a.m. on the day of the celebration, about 500,000 people had gathered in the field, and rumor began to spread that there wasn't enough presents or food to go around for everyone. A military force of 1,800 failed to keep civil order, and the human stampede that ensued killed nearly 1,400 people and injured 1,300 more. This would later be known as the Kadinka tragedy. While the Kadinka tragedy was certainly not intentional and probably the result of no foresight and very poor planning, it's certainly not a great way to start your reign. But while that was poor planning, the things that would follow were definitely a result of something far more upsetting and malicious, like the anti-Semitic pogroms, which terrorized and killed Jews from 64 towns and 226 villages from the year 1903 to 1906 alone. Adding to this growing pile of death and unrest, the famous Bloody Sunday of 1905, which was perhaps the first key event that would eventually bring about the end of Nicholas II's reign. Note, this Bloody Sunday should not be confused with U2's song Sunday Bloody Sunday, which in fact refers to the 1972 Bogside Massacre in Northern Ireland. Maybe that's another curiosity on the rise. Now, decades earlier, Alexander II emancipated all of the serfs in Russia, which is fantastic because it gave 23 million people their liberty. It was less fantastic in that there was nothing put into place to prepare Russia for this giant societal and economic shift. This entirely new peasant working class made up the majority of all urban areas. They were generally unskilled, they received incredibly low wages, worked in horribly unsafe work environments, and sometimes worked up to about 15 hours a day. Although some workers still had a paternalistic relationship with their employer, factory employers were a lot more present and active than any of the landowners these serfs used to work for. So under serfdom, peasants had very little to no contact with their landowner. But in this new urban setting, factory employers often used their power in completely abusive and arbitrary ways. This abuse of power, made evident by low wages, criminally long work hours, and complete lack of any safety precautions, led to strikes in Russia. And on January 22nd, while they were holding holy symbols and singing hymns and patriotic songs, these strikes marched towards the Winter Palace. Though the royals were not in residence, about 10,000 troops had been ordered to stop columns of marchers before they reached the palace square. The government forces were inconsistent and confused. Individual policemen saluted the religious banners and portraits of the Tsar, or even joined the procession. Army officers variously told marchers they could proceed on in smaller groups, that they should disperse, or ordered their troops to fire upon the marchers without warning. As late as 2 p.m., large family groups were still promenading around the Nevsky Prospect, as was customary for Sunday afternoons, completely unaware of the violence happening elsewhere. Amongst them, though, were parties of workers still making their way towards the Winter Palace as intended. After a single shouted warning, 4 volleys were fired into the panicked crowd, most of whom weren't even participants in the marches. Now, the discrepancy in the reports of casualties is a little disturbing. Tsar officials reported 96 dead and 330 injured. Enemies of the government reported 4,000 dead, and moderate estimates still say about 1,000 dead or injured by either being shot or trampled. Now, I know that's a lot to take in, but I need you to add on top of all that Nicholas II's violent suppression of the Revolution of 1905, which included worker strikes, peasant unrest, and military mutinies. Now, add a little cherry on top of that, the fact that he really liked to execute any of his political enemies. Oh, and let's not forget the perceived responsibility he had for the Russo-Japanese War. Because not only was Russia decidedly defeated, but Russia's entire naval presence in the Baltic Sea was completely annihilated. Now, I know you know that's a lot, but I want to put these strikes really in perspective for you. In the 32 years prior to Nicholas II's reign, there was about 610 strikes in all of Russia. Now, mind you, I'm not entirely sure how this data I was looking at measured a strike, like how many people had to be involved, but let's just say at least one factory had to uprise against workers. So 610 strikes in the 32 years prior to Nicholas II's reign, okay? Now, the number of strikes from 1895 to 1905? 1,700 in 10 years! 1,700 strikes in 10 years as opposed to the 610 that occurred over 32. So when I say, of course the Romanovs weren't dethroned because Rasputin made a creepy pact with the dark forces, I want you to fully understand my meaning. Rasputin did play a significant role, however, in the imperial couple's increasing unpopularity, but that's a story for another time. Russian royalty in general is pretty intense, but this whole time period is just... Okay, so now that you have a better idea of why Nicholas II was the last Russian emperor and how his forced abdication and execution came about, let's talk about...
Though the Tsar did not survive, one daughter may be still alive.
As many stories have spun, including Assassin's Creed Chronicles, Nicholas II's 17-year-old daughter Anastasia allegedly escaped the terrible fate that befell her family. What you might not know is that her brother Alexei, 13 years old, was also said to have escaped. Rumors circulated that the two had been shielded from the executioner's bullets because of family jewels that had been sewn into their clothing for safekeeping. Anastasia's fate was particularly prone to these conjectures, as a number of women claiming to be the Grand Duchess periodically surfaced.
Grandma, it's me, Anastasia.
The most well-known of these women was Anna Anderson, who, beginning in the early 1920s, fought to prove she was the rightful recipient of Anastasia's inheritance. She even met with Anastasia's aunt on several occasions, and her cousin, but neither were convinced, and for good reason. Years later, she would be identified as Franziska, a Polish factory worker born in 1896. She disappeared in 1920 and was later pulled out of a canal in Berlin, where she was institutionalized in a mental hospital. One of the inmates told her she looked like Tatiana, one of Nicholas II's other daughters. 18 months later, after a rigorous study of magazines and more, she was claiming to be the lost princess. While Anastasia's family was certainly not convinced, she had the support of Gleb Botkin. Botkin had good knowledge of palace life, and a lot of things you really probably wouldn't have read about in a magazine. In fact, a lot of her supporters seemed to be there if they thought that they could benefit from her being identified as Anastasia. But alas for the thieves, she would not be identified as the Grand Duchess, and the mystery would continue. Then, finally, in the 1970s, an amateur archaeologist uncovered a shallow grave, where he discovered well-aged skeletons of 6 adults and 3 children. But he suppressed these findings until the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, a forensic investigation identified the 9 bodies as the royal family and their servants, but Anastasia and Alexei's bodies were missing. It wasn't until 2007 that a nearby second grave was located, and through DNA analysis, conclusively identified Anastasia and Alexei's bodies, thus finally closing the door on nearly a century of mystery and speculation. And now that you're equipped with historical context, you can trek into a digital alternate reality where Anastasia got to escape that execution by the grace of the Assassin's Order, weirdly enough. But I'm sure it's going to be a whole ton of fun nonetheless. Share your favorite facts about the fall of the Romanovs with your fellow Curiosities in the comments below. And if there's something you want to learn about, be sure to let me know. Keep on the windy side of care, my loves, and of course, stay curious. Bye.